My randomized word of inspiration for this project was eviscerate. Eviscerate, verb, deprive something or someone of its essential content. Naturally, I wanted to focus on the visual motif of something tearing apart, something losing an essential part of itself. Throughout our lessons about how to brainstorm and conceptualize in the most effective way, I feel as though mind mapping taught me a lot. I have so many thoughts when faced with a creative project. I don't know whether to go metaphorical with the concept or literal or be serious or be fun. And spewing all of those possibilities out on the page helps draw a decent connection between them. Looking at a lot of the other words I wrote down for possibilities of the word of inspiration, they're very edgy. Obviously, I was hoping for something I could turn into a horror-themed concept, so I was over the moon when the word that was randomized for me ended up being something with so much energy. I knew I could really get a lot of mileage out of it. In terms of inspiration, I'm no stranger to horror movies. I love them. And especially with this project coming along right in the midst of Halloween season, I turned to a lot of the classics for reference, specifically body horror movies such as The Fly and, of course, The Thing, and the more recent film, The Substance. The Substance even showed up directly referenced in some of my sketches for the final sculpture. At this point, I'll start focusing on the individual investigations we were assigned. The first one being a non-objective paper collage was tricky. I've learned that I really truly struggle with non-objective concepts as an artist. Branching outside of the way you typically think is difficult. I tend to think of things through a very black and white lens. Drawing an object I can make sense of visually is where my comfort zone lies. This lesson is about breaking out of that, though. I typically at least start with something that has a solid form and then abstract it from there, though I'm not sure I pushed the design as far as I possibly could. I landed on this thumbnail, which I knew was going to be the one I'd like the most the second I came up with it. All of them involved big, irregular shapes and lots of diagonals, mostly directed outwards from a central focal point. I thought the fish was the one with the most striking contrast. The other compositions felt more random, but the more readable and geometric shapes of the fish's head and body juxtaposed against these goopy, irregular droplet shapes in the center made it feel more impactful, like an action rather than a stagnant image. I'm proud of how the collage came out. Slicing out all those itty-bitty curved lines was certainly a hassle, but it was worth it for the sense of movement that the collage ended up having. Moving on to the 3D paper sketches in Investigation 2, this one really wasn't too complicated. It felt more like a game than anything. I was barely thinking about my verb at all, and instead just trying to come up with visually interesting forms. This particular form led to a few sketches that I really liked for my final sculpture. As I said in my process book, to fit with the theme of evisceration, the subject matter had to involve organic matter without making anatomical sense. Still too objective, but I was getting on the right track. Back to that word, eviscerate. I'm thinking of diagonals, pieces of a solid form coming apart at the seams, something that had a clear line of action. That line of thinking was what led me to this sketch, which ended up being the basis for my final sculpture. I did another mock-up of it digitally, and all of a sudden it was time for Investigation 3, which was actually realizing a three-dimensional form based on all the brainstorming surrounding that single word of inspiration. It started off clunky, I won't lie. Building things is so enjoyable, but initially the structure was hanging on for dear life. It was Frankenstein together with hot glue strings, paper mache scraps, a strip or two of foam board, and jewelry wire. It's honestly insane to me to think that this is the skeleton inside the finished product that I'm actually very proud of. After a nice burn on my leg from some hot glue and a trip to Blick for some masking tape, I was really getting somewhere with making this thing more structurally sound. At this stage, it's clear that I'm trying to mimic the structure of a human hand for the base of the sculpture. Back in the initial jewelry wire stage, I wrapped this super thin wire around my fingers and created all these little springs to make a rough cast of my own hand. I'll be honest, I had no idea if it would work, but it really helped. I have a history involving some rough paper mache projects that lacked any real solid base, and considering I was planning on paper macheing most of the sculpture, that didn't exactly bode well. But I am to learn from my mistakes, and starting strong with wire and tape before paper and glue was a good decision. The next step I decided was using paper towels to drape over the structure I'd built. This is exactly why the base mattered. A wet paper towel cannot stand on its own, and had I not paced myself, it would have never come together in the end. I saturated the paper towel with loads of tacky glue to make it both sturdy and ensure that I could dry it with my hairdryer, which was on basically 24/7 throughout this investigation. Waiting for that to dry, I turned to acrylic paint, mostly relying on deep reds because, again, evisceration. I wanted to mimic the inside of something organic. I'm incredibly proud of this line of action I was able to achieve with the stagnant form. The way the bumpy, curved tail of the sculpture flows into a larger form that opens up and folds over itself, it was just what I was going for. It has the perfect visual balance and a nice gravity-defying curve to go along with it, but it wasn't quite enough. The texture of the paper towel on its own was bothering me, and it didn't feel grounded enough. Not to mention that the folds were laying much flatter than I wanted them to. The solution? Keep sculpting, of course. I turned to a really smart method of paper mache that I found on Pinterest, soaking a roll of toilet paper and mixing it with some white glue. Incredibly versatile paper clay. This was also around the time when I realized that time-lapsing the process might be helpful. The downside to this method was that it took days to fully dry, even with the help of my hairdryer, but eventually it was solid enough to cover with tissue paper in order to clean up that bumpy paper clay texture. I was going for something smoother looking, again mimicking insides. Given more time, I would have sanded it down a ton, but I'm satisfied with the texture I was able to achieve. The final stage, painting. The initial paint job was rushed, to say the least. I didn't think about much more than coverage, but really focusing several hours just on the paint job for the second draft, I was able to think through the color theory and the values, how I could define the dark crevices and highlight the points that stood out the most. I'm so happy with this paint job. It's just gross looking and exactly the way I wanted it to be. I worked from dark to light, filling most of it in with red before going back over the bumpier parts with dark yellow and later a light fleshy tone. I used a beauty sponge for that part because the paintbrushes weren't quite cutting it. Too many little strokes and the paint would end up in places I didn't want it. Big shout out to both Maida and JoJo's Bizarre Adventure for making this part of the process the most enjoyable by far. After a few touch-ups with high gloss varnish, that's all of my process with this investigation and by extension this project. Words on paper to finished product. I learned a lot along the way. Specifically, I learned to A, pace myself and never rush a traditional art piece before it's structurally sound. B, be sure to push a shape or form as far as I possibly can to communicate an idea. And C, consider first drafts as a draft rather than a failure. I'm really glad I kept sculpting after I realized I didn't like the first iteration. The paper clay ended up creating a much more interesting form than the paper towel on its own could. Thank you for taking this time and interest in my process, and I hope I was able to illustrate properly how I've grown as an artist throughout each and every investigation surrounding this project.